Hello everybody. Welcome to Organizational Psychology. So we've talked about diversity, and we've talked about diversity in terms of, affirmative action, valuing diversity, managing diversity. But really our approach to talking about diversity at that point in time is what does it mean for our organization and what can we expect? There's another aspect that we need to consider, that is perhaps that we will be assigned to a portion of the company, a foreign assignment, so to speak. So understanding culture takes on another dimension, that is we may be operating in cultures that are foreign to us. And I think it's fair to say, and the data certainly backs it up, that foreign assignment becomes more and more a likely probability as we see organizations globalize. So it's probably not all that crazy to consider that you in fact will maybe be given a foreign assignment, or a foreign assignment might represent a great opportunity for your career at some point. So let's talk about managing across cultures. Let's talk about what culture is. And it's a set of values that promote or constrain thoughts and behaviors that are compatible or incompatible with those beliefs and values. Culture is the hidden hand that has a profound effect on us that we're largely unaware of, right? So ethnocentrism then is the belief that our culture is better. And you can see where it's a basic human motive to behave somewhat ethnocentrically. Why wouldn't we think our culture is better? The weird thing about culture to me, and let's say nationalism, is there's some things in life we have absolutely no control over. And the culture, the country in which we were born is something we have no control over. So to believe that my culture is better largely stems out of something that was a random factor, a random chance. It's a roll of the dice that we were born in the United States, or it's a roll of the dice that we're born in France. I mean, it's something completely out of our control. So I like to step back and say one of the best approaches to culture is not determine which culture is better, right? I mean, why go there in the first place? It's that cultures differ. And what's important is to understand how they differ and to be able to maybe assess some pros and cons as a result of that. But remember, the pros and cons are value judgments, and it's largely kind of a compatibility issue. So, ethnocentrism then creates this particular lens that affects perception, thought, and reactions. So to understand our culture and our culture's influence on us maybe allows us to shed ethnocentrism and become more open-minded and more flexible in our approach to other cultures. The problem with ethnocentrism is it creates a preference for hiring one's own, that is, members of my own culture. And often this is simply kind of, not necessarily intentional. It can be somewhat unintentional, and it just gets to the idea that I am more comfortable with people of my own kind, right? And if comfort is what we seek in life, that's fine, but if challenge is what really kind of turns us on, and adapting and growing, then exposure to cross-cultural influences becomes a powerful plus, if you will, right? So this hiring one's own bias, right, is bad for business. It causes recruiting difficulties, high turnover rates, and it can lead to lawsuits. So learning, as we talked about in the diversity lecture, learning to manage diversity is a great approach to this. Now, cultural intelligence? We've heard of, cognitive intelligence. We've heard of emotional intelligence. Well, yeah, there is cultural intelligence. And cultural intelligence is kind of cool because I think it kind of bridges emotional intelligence, right? That is, boy, these people are different than me, and that tends to make me anxious because I'm anxious about the unknown would be a good example of emotional intelligence, but applied in a cultural setting or to cross-cultural stimuli, right? And the cognitive intelligence is this ability to step above and look down at ourselves and look at the way we're processing our environment. It's actually meta-intelligence, if you will, or intelligence about intelligence, metacognition. So this requires learning cultural tendencies and what might be typified in a given culture and what to expect. Understanding that, of course, individual differences can still An analysis of individual differences is still required. So this requires emotional intelligence, and it requires the need to be able to separate, right, culture from personality. And that is, when we engage in a new culture, we're engaging people. And those people have their personalities. When we talk about culture and the influence of culture, that is the big term on average. On average, people from this culture might behave in this manner or view the world in this way. But notice, individual differences mean there's going to be a range of responses within any given culture. Strangely, when we talk about our culture, we're willing to embrace the individual differences. Well, we say, yes, we're American, but that, only means as much. There's a huge variation in what it means to be American. Strangely, ethnocentrism, when we look at another culture, we say, well, the people in my culture are quite variable, but the assumption is the people in that other culture are very homogenous. They vary little. And of course, that is the ultimate attribution error as described by Pettigrew back in the day. So the big divide when we want to understand cultures, the first place to go really is individualistic versus collectivist cultures. So what do we see? Individualistic cultures, individual attainment is one's priority. So let's try this out. How many of you have come to school to find yourself or to choose your own way or to choose your profession to figure that out? Okay, I mean, many of us are, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do this, I want to do this. And notice, I. The deal is, what might benefit your community or family to the greatest extent? No, that's not a trick question, but it's not a question that we ask ourselves very much. I want to become a lawyer. How would that impact my family? How might it affect future generations? How might it affect my children? How might it affect my community? How does it, meet my country's needs? Or these questions probably sound foreign to many of us who are big-time individualists, right? Now, another feature of this, a cognitive feature that's kind of unrelated to that, is we tend to, in individualistic cultures, because you are your own person and you choose your own path, and success or failure is largely dependent on you. At least that's the individualistic, kind of the Horatio Alger myth. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? You can be anything you want to be if you work hard enough. Our attributions then tend to be dispositional. That is, if we see someone who has gone through life and is largely unsuccessful in our estimation, as an individualistic, I say, well, they obviously didn't work hard enough, or they didn't do this, or they didn't do that. That I ignore situational forces that might have constrained their opportunities, right? I'm sounding like a true social psychologist or sociologist at this point, right? I make these dispositional attributions. They failed because of their character, or they succeeded because of their character, not because of their opportunities or situation. Collectivist culture, and let's go back then, putting the needs before others. So what would be valuable to my society now? Right? Do we really need more lawyers in the United States? And I'm not, dishing on you guys who are pre-law or thinking about going to law school. But a collectivist attitude is, what contribution might be most useful to my culture? How can I fit in? What does my country need? Does it need attorneys? Or does it need doctors? So, well, I want to be an attorney, right? Well, but the need really now is for medical professionals, or whatever it is. So it's not something that we tend to focus on in the United States as a great example of an individualistic culture. Now, the other aspect, right, and the second point for collectivists, as well as it was for individualists, when we describe the causes of behavior from a collectivist point of view, we tend to look at the circumstances. We tend to look at the situation. So we focus on what surrounds the actor we're trying to explain. Say, well, of course they did that because these forces were operating on them in this way. Not something we typically do in the United States, unless it applies to us and we're trying to explain our failure, right? And that's the actor-observer effect, if you will. We're going to talk about these later on. But attributions tend to be more complex and more situational in collectivist cultures. Okay? So, an interesting aside, in Brewer's lab, in Marilyn's lab, she had several people working in this area and looking at difference between individualistic and collectivist cultures. She had a lot of Asian collaborators, and Asian countries are largely collectivist. They actually primed individualistic versus collectivist mindsets in the laboratory. Right? And they would do this. One way they did it was just have people read. They say, we got a couple experiments, so the first experiment that people were exposed to was a priming manipulation, and they would measure the results in the second experiment. That they would give people a written sheet, right? It was just a story, and one version of the story had I, me, my. The other version of the story was written with we, us, etc., ours. And people were told, this is just a linguistic processing task. Circle all the pronouns as quickly as you can. So people thought they were being timed. They would circle the pronouns. What's happening is one condition is being primed with I, me, my, individualistic words. The other condition is being primed with collectivist words, me, my, me, ours, etc. I mean, ours, us, etc. You get the idea, all right? So then they would put people into a task, and what they found is that people could be primed either to be more individualistic or more collectivist. And of course, they recorded participants' country of origin, right? And just as an aside, this wasn't the hypothesis. This is something they just found kind of in looking at the data. So it's not a solid. It's not been necessarily empirically reassessed or verified. It's not been replicated. That it was easier to prime collectivists to be individualistic. That is, people who grew up in a collectivist country, it was easier to prime them to be individualistic than it was to prime people who grew up as individualistic societies to be collectivist. And what I took away from that is, and this is me speaking in my opinion, so let me be clear on it, that I think collectivist societies are actually more advanced and more complex than individualistic societies. We can also look at lifespan development studies and maybe support that idea. But I'm going way out on a limb there. But for those of us who think individualism is superior, what I want to toss out to you is, what is your evidence that individualistic societies or individualism is superior to collectivism? And maybe just question that idea or that stereotype that we would have as Americans. Right? And see, this is one of the benefits of cross-cultural studies and cross-cultural exposure, because we begin to start shedding our ethnocentrism and saying simply that our culture is better, and saying, what are the pluses and minuses of all these different cultures, individualism and collectivism. Now, I want to talk about my buddy Maddox, Will Maddox. He and I went to graduate school together. I probably described Maddox to you before. He spent 4 years living in Japan, married a Japanese woman. One of the areas that he studied was this idea of the ripple effect, and collectivist cultures tend to see causality as stretching further than individualistic cultures. So if something happens in an individualistic culture, we say, who did that? And then we pretty much call it good. We pinpoint the actor, we explain what occurred in terms of their disposition. Well, of course that happened because that's the way they are, and we're done. And it's a rather simplistic analysis, right? Saves time, to be sure, but it often hides the fact that people are embedded in a situation. And it's the situation that has greater power over the behavior than who they are, that is their disposition. Deming would resonate with this, because remember the 85-15 rule, that is 85% of the outcomes are the result of the system. That is the big situational components. And only 15% are the responsibility of the actor, that would be the dispositional. The thing is that situational explanations are more complex and they take more time, but they tend to be more accurate. So it is a trade-off. And one thing in human evolution, we have fast processes, we have slow processes, and it's always a negotiation of the two, some compromise. Collectivist cultures tend to see a broader range of consequences to a behavior. So they tend to look in a broader array, and they tend to understand the consequences to a better extent. Right? Additionally, there's been greater success in priming individuals' mindsets, as I suggested. So the conceptions of the self, when we look at how do you describe yourself? Well, if an independent view of the self is largely the result of an individualistic society. So we see ourselves and we're surrounded by all these people, but notice there's really no overlap. We are our own, I am my own man, right? Or I am my own woman is kind of the cliche for individualistic societies. If you're raised in a collective society, what you do is you see yourself embedded in these relationships, and other people are actually a part of you, that you're comprised, you're a more complex being, right? And these people shape your behavior. To give an example, I went over to Will's house, and when he was living in Chicago, he was doing his postdoc at Northwestern, the Kellogg School of Business there, as he was off on his path to teaching organizational psychology and leadership, etc. Negotiation is one of his specialties. And I was sitting there, and his wife Takako, Japanese, right, came out, and she handed me a beverage. And I thought it was kind of unusual, because she didn't ask me what I wanted to drink. She handed me a beverage. It happened to be exactly what I wanted to drink, right? And so, being that we are the way we are, and we love to analyze behavior, even if it's our own behavior, I said, Takako, that's interesting, because most of the time you go to someone's house, they ask, what can I get you? And she said, in Japan, that would be considered impolite. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she says, in Japan, I should know what you want. And notice, if we're embedded, that is, here is me and here's my friend Takako, right? She should know enough about me and care enough about me to actually know what it is I would prefer that she has. And notice that would be considered rude in the United States, but it would be considered rude to ask me what I wanted because she would be admitting that she didn't know me well enough to know that. Which is better? And again, I want to get to this point that it's not a question of what's better, it's a question of how is it different. And that's what becomes absolutely fascinating. So the influence of cultural orientation on the self then, individualistic cultures, it's largely about personal achievement, right? The tendency to overestimate one's contribution to the team effort, to take credit for the self and blame others for failure. So one thing that we could do is when you're doing a team project, I could have everyone independently rate their contribution to the project. And what we'll see, and this study's been done, individualistic culture folks, if we have 4 people in the team, people are going to say, like, I did 40%, I did 40%, I did 50%, and I did 60%. And when you come away from it, your 4 people on the team did 180% of 100. Right? In a collectivist culture, it's the opposite. You ask people, what was your contribution? They'll say, it was 20%, 10%, right? And then you're going to get the total combined contribution of the team was like 80% of 100%. So, different approach to things, right? Collectivist cultures, they derive more satisfaction from the status of the valued group, right? So it's not individualistic achievement that becomes as important. It becomes the group level achievement, right? And people tend to underestimate their role in the production of this percentage. So, let's take a look at the globe project. And it's a pretty fancy globe there, right? So, what becomes important in terms of cultural dimensions? What knowledge should we start to embrace? How should we then look on what dimensions should we look at the difference between cultures? And we're going to talk power distance, we're going to talk uncertainty avoidance, societal collectivism, in-group collectivism, gender egalitarianism, assertiveness, future orientation, performance orientation, humane orientation. So let's look at these cultural dimensions. Let's put some definitions to them. So power distance is the endorsement of unequal power distribution. So to what extent do we believe that people should have equal opportunity, people should be treated equally? To what extent are we willing to allow for vast differences in the, let's say, for the accumulation of wealth? And we see that the French Revolution was largely precipitated by an ever increasingly wealthy ruling class that lost touch with the commoner. And as Louis XIV, 15 are building Versailles and they're creating this opulent circumstance, what they're really doing is taking money out of France and spending it on themselves. Right? So the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that's the distance, right, that reflects power. To what extent do we allow for that? To what extent do we say that's okay? And that would be the endorsement of unequal power distribution. To what extent can the few rule the many and find that acceptable? And this is why royalty has been undone in so many countries, because it represented the ultimate power distance. When we look at the United States is becoming increasingly a power distant country. That is endorsing higher and higher levels of power distance. We have 1% of the United States population that now owns 80% of the wealth. Okay, if you think that's cool, hey, whatever, then you endorse tremendous power distance. If you say, no, that's not too cool, then you're kind of falling on the opposite spectrum, saying, I'm not down with power distance. Right? Switzerland recently put a cap on CEO salaries. So CEOs' salaries are governed by lower salaries. That is, you can only earn so much more than the average income, that there are limits on it. We can argue, how much money does Bezos need? At what point does it become absurd, right? But notice that this is largely a political argument then. People say, oh, you should be allowed to make as much as you want. And other people say, no, I think things should be held more in check, should be more similar. So, cultural dimension, number one, power distance. Let's look at number two, uncertainty avoidance. To what extent does a culture, right, rely on cultural norms and rules as a buffer to uncertainty? So the more norms we put in place, the more rules we put in place, the more people feel that the future is certain, that it's under control. As we diminish rules, as we diminish norms, then the future is largely uncertain. And again, politically, we see in the United States right now, a lot of forces saying we need to go back. We need to go back to the way it is, because moving forward causes uncertainty, it causes anxiety. And what about the good old days? We need to go back to the good old days when people knew their place and they stayed in their place. Right? So uncertainty avoidance. Another dimension we can look at is institutional collectivism, extent to which leaders reward and encourage loyalty to a social unit. Now this can be at a national level, but we can also morph this quite easily into an organization. To what extent do we reward the stars in an organization, pinpoint, oh, look at what that person did, and lavish a reward on them? Or to what extent do we put that more at a team level, or rewards come as a function of loyalty, right? In-group collectivism, how much pride, loyalty should individuals have towards their family or organization? Again, similar to the other. Gender egalitarianism, how much effort should be put in achieving a gender equality? In the United States, we can see the answer to that is little, if any, effort should be put into that. We still don't have an equal rights amendment. Right? So we still endorse differential treatment of men and women in this country. Where are the leaders in gender egalitarianism? We're going to look, but Scandinavian countries are and notice that Scandinavian countries and Northern European countries have a relatively high number of female country leaders. Okay. Other cultural dimensions, assertiveness. How confrontational and dominant should people be in relationships? What's allowed? What's culturally acceptable? What isn't? Obviously, in the United States, we've gotten to the point now where assertiveness has gone over the top. It's not even assertiveness anymore. It's just outward, unkind aggression. Right? To what extent should that be allowed or not? And notice in Japan, you don't get away with being outwardly assertive. That you have to keep it on the down low. You have to be kind of more calm in this regard. Future orientation. To what extent should people delay gratification by planning and saving for the future? Okay. Performance orientation. How much should people be rewarded for performance and excellence versus, let's say, for example, seniority? And humane orientation. How much should society encourage and reward kindness, fairness, and friendliness as opposed to kind of Shark Tank kind of behavior that is doing the competitor and destroying them, so to speak. Let's call it the end of part 1, and let's look at the rankings on the globe cultural dimensions in part 2.